Commander Elias Ward stood on the deck of the HMS Resolute, letting the cold morning wind brush past his face as the ship drifted out of the harbor. From a distance, the naval base looked proud and powerful, filled with large warships that towered like floating fortresses. But the Resolute was not one of them. It sat low in the water, smaller and shaped differently from every other ship in the fleet. Its odd, rounded hull and narrow back section made it look almost like a transport ferry rather than a warship. Even the paint seemed to highlight its strange proportions, making the vessel appear more like a harmless experiment than a ship meant for battle. As the Resolute moved through the water, sailors on nearby ships turned their heads to stare. Some smirked, some laughed openly, and others simply shook their heads. The jokes had already become famous around the base. Ward's Wonder, they called it. The Sea Pretzel. The Floating Egg. Every day brought a new nickname, and every day Ward pretended not to hear them. But he did. He heard every word, and so did his crew. The crew members, most of them young and newly assigned, felt the stares even more sharply. They had all hoped for prestigious placements, maybe on the massive ironclad Serpent or the twin-turreted Sovereign. Instead, they had been assigned to the Navy's strangest ship, one that many claimed would sink before it ever fired its first cannon. Some of the sailors tried to keep their spirits up, making jokes among themselves, but others felt embarrassed whenever they set foot on the deck. The atmosphere inside the ship was quiet during the first days at sea. The corridors were narrow and the metal walls made every sound echo as if the ship itself were whispering. Even though the Resolute had new engines and the most advanced navigation systems the Navy had ever funded, the crew could not shake the feeling that they were trapped in a floating mistake. They walked carefully, unsure whether to trust a ship everyone else mocked. Commander Ward, however, felt something different. He had chosen this ship. While other officers rejected the assignment, he accepted it without hesitation. He had studied the ship's blueprints, spoken to its engineers, and walked through every compartment during its construction. Where others saw an awkward design, he saw potential. The reinforced hull meant the ship could survive hits that would tear other vessels apart. The experimental propulsion system, which used a complex arrangement of underwater jets, allowed it to turn sharply and accelerate far faster than any traditional propeller-driven ship. The shape that everyone made fun of was designed to reduce drag and let the Resolute slip through the water like a knife. Ward remembered the day the ship had been completed. The engineers, tired and stained with oil, had stood proudly beside the finished vessel. But when the higher-ranking officers arrived to inspect it, their expressions shifted from confusion to disappointment. Some whispered that the project had been a waste of funding. Others asked why anyone would design a serious warship that looked like that. One admiral had even laughed, shaking his head as he walked away. Ward never forgot that moment. It was the first time he felt a flicker of anger, not for himself, but for the people who had put their souls into building something new. Now as the Resolute moved across the water, he walked across the deck with quiet confidence. His steps were steady, and his gaze was calm. The crew noticed this, though they did not fully understand it yet. They respected him not because he was loud or commanding, but because he carried himself like someone who believed in them even when others didn't. One evening, after a long day of basic drills, a group of sailors gathered near the bow. The sky was darkening into a deep blue, and the waves glowed faintly in the fading light. They spoke softly, thinking the commander was nowhere near. "Do you think the ship is safe?" one asked. "I heard it barely passed the stability tests." Another replied, "Yeah, and those engines," a third added, lowering his voice. "They say they're too powerful for a ship this size. What if something blows?" Just then, they heard footsteps. Commander Ward appeared beside them, leaning casually against the railing. His presence made them straighten instantly. "I've read the same reports," Ward said calmly, "and I've spoken to the engineers. This ship is safe. More than safe, actually. It's stronger than you think." The sailors exchanged quick glances. One of them gathered courage and asked, "Sir, why did you choose this ship?" Ward looked out at the ocean for a long moment, letting the silence settle. Then he answered, "Because every improvement in history started with something people laughed at. The first iron ships were mocked. The first steam engines were mocked. Innovation always looks foolish at the beginning." His words were simple, but the sincerity behind them settled something inside the sailors. They knew he wasn't dismissing their concerns. He understood them and still believed. Over the next few days, the Resolute's daily routine began to take shape. Ward ordered light training drills to familiarize the crew with the ship's unusual layout. The central control room, positioned lower than usual, allowed for better protection but required new navigation habits. The engine rooms were small but complex, filled with pipes, gauges, and vents that hummed with controlled energy. The armory housed the ship's experimental rapid-fire cannons, compact weapons that were easy to aim but required perfect timing from their operators. The crew discovered that the ship handled differently from anything they had trained on before. When the propulsion jets activated, the ship responded instantly, almost too sharply. During the first maneuver drill, several crew members stumbled as the Resolute pivoted faster than they expected, but after their initial surprise, a few of them smiled. The ship might look strange, but it moved like nothing they had ever seen. As the crew grew more comfortable, Ward pushed them gently but consistently. He didn't yell or threaten. He simply expected effort, focus, and cooperation. When a sailor struggled with a task, he took time to demonstrate personally. When someone succeeded, he acknowledged it quietly but clearly. Slowly, the atmosphere on the ship began to change. The sailors still heard jokes from the other ships whenever they returned to the harbor, but the laughter bothered them less. They were starting to know the Resolute in a way the mockers never would. One night a sudden storm rolled in. The waves rose high, and the wind lashed against the ship with fierce strength. On any other vessel, the storm might have caused chaos, but the Resolute cut through the water smoothly, its rounded hull absorbing the impact like a shield. The crew watched with surprise as the ship handled the storm with remarkable stability. The engines hummed steadily, keeping the vessel straight even as the world around them shook. "Looks like the ship isn't as weak as they say," one sailor muttered, gripping the railing. "It's tougher than half the fleet," another replied, amazed. Ward heard them and smiled to himself. This storm, though dangerous, was exactly what the crew needed. They were beginning to trust the ship not because he told them to, but because they had seen its strengths with their own eyes. By the time the storm cleared, something had changed. The crew walked with more confidence. They moved with more purpose. The ship that everyone mocked was slowly becoming a place they felt connected to, a place that might just surprise the world one day. Commander Ward knew they still had a long way to go. The jokes from the naval base would continue. Doubts would linger, but the foundation was forming, the first spark of belief, the first whisper of pride, and he understood that once a crew truly believed in their ship, no amount of ridicule could break that bond. The HMS Resolute still looked strange from the outside, but inside, a transformation was beginning. The ship had started its journey not just across the ocean, but toward the day when all the laughter and mockery would fade into silence, replaced by awe, respect, and the unstoppable force of a ship no one saw coming. The days passed slowly, and the jokes about the HMS Resolute only grew louder. Every time the ship returned to the main harbor, sailors from other vessels would lean on their rails, waiting with fresh comments. Some made exaggerated gestures, pretending to wobble like the Resolute. Others shouted things like, "Careful, don't tip over," or "Is it a warship or a bathtub?" Even officers from higher-ranking ships glanced at the Resolute with polite but obvious amusement. It was clear that no one in the Navy expected anything greater or even useful from this strange vessel. Inside the ship, the crew tried to ignore the mockery. They kept their heads down when they walked past other sailors. They pretended not to hear the laughter or the muttered insults. But even though they acted calm on the outside, many began to doubt themselves. They wondered if being on the Resolute meant they weren't good enough to serve on important ships. A few whispered that maybe the Navy had assigned them here because they weren't skilled, or because no one else wanted them. Commander Elias Ward saw these changes. He watched the way some of his crew avoided eye contact. He saw how their shoulders slumped when they heard others laughing from across the docks. But instead of giving long speeches, Ward focused on something more practical, preparing them. If everyone else doubted the Resolute, then the crew needed to become the one group who didn't. Every morning, Ward made sure training started early. He assigned his officers to teach the crew everything from engine control to emergency maneuvers to rapid-fire weapon handling. The drills were harder than those on older ships, because the Resolute required precise teamwork. Its systems were different, its layout unfamiliar, and its movements unpredictable to anyone who wasn't constantly practicing. At first, the crew complained quietly. Some muttered that the drills were too intense, especially for a ship that never got serious missions. But Ward kept pushing, and slowly the crew began to change. They learned how to coordinate with speed and accuracy. They mastered the unusual propulsion system, which demanded careful timing and communication. They practiced turning the ship sharply at full speed, something only the Resolute could do. Every time they succeeded, their confidence grew a little more. But outside the ship, the tension in the world was rising. Rumors spread across the naval base, first in whispers, then in serious briefings. An enemy nation had been increasing its naval strength. Their ships were larger, heavily armored, and known for aggressive tactics. Satellite images, intercepted messages, and old political grudges all pointed to the same thing: preparation for a sudden attack. Many officers dismissed the idea at first. They believed their own navy was too powerful to be challenged. But as more evidence surfaced, attitudes changed. High command began to hold emergency meetings. Patrol routes were modified. Ships were checked and repaired. Ammunition was stocked and counted twice over, except for the Resolute. Because of its reputation, most commanders didn't even consider the ship during tactical planning. They didn't assign it to important routes. They didn't include it in strategic formations. Some didn't even look at it. Ward noticed this immediately. One day, during a meeting among officers, Ward requested permission for the Resolute to participate in a defense simulation exercise. Another commander chuckled under his breath. A different officer gave an awkward smile and politely explained that the simulation required reliable ships. Ward felt a flicker of anger, but he kept his face calm, nodded, and left the room. Later that evening, in the dim light of his cabin, Ward reviewed maps and reports. He traced his finger over the coastline, noticing gaps in the fleet's coverage. Many of the strongest ships were stationed too far south. Others were undergoing repairs or were stuck in distant waters. In the northern sector, where intelligence predicted the enemy might strike, only a handful of ships were in position and none could reach the region quickly if something happened, except the Resolute. Ward leaned back in his chair, realizing what the others had failed to see. The Resolute's speed and maneuverability meant it could reach the northern sector faster than any ship in the fleet. It didn't matter what the critics thought if the enemy attacked early. The Resolute might be the only vessel capable of responding in time. But he said nothing to the others. He chose instead to prepare quietly. Around this time, the crew's mood was lifting. Their repeated drills had made them sharper, faster, and more confident. The few sailors who had once complained the most were now the ones who pushed their teammates to work harder. They still felt the sting of being mocked, but they had developed a bond with the ship and with each other. One night, while off duty, a group of crew members sat eating late-night rations in the mess hall. The room was small but warm, filled with the hum of nearby machinery. "You know," a sailor named Harlow said between bites, "I used to think this ship was a joke." "So did we all," another replied with a grin. "No, I mean really a joke. Like I thought it wouldn't even survive a storm." Everyone laughed, remembering the storm they had passed through earlier. The Resolute had handled more smoothly than most ships 3 times its size, but now, Harlow continued, lowering his voice a little, "I feel like we're part of something different, not weaker, just overlooked." A young technician nodded. "If we ever get the chance, I think we could surprise a lot of people." At that moment, Commander Ward entered the mess hall quietly. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he smiled slightly and walked past them with a nod. The crew's conversation had reached him, and he felt a small sense of pride. They were beginning to believe not just in the ship, but in themselves. But outside the ship, the ridiculing didn't stop. One morning just before sunrise, the Resolute returned to harbor after a 3-day patrol. The water was calm, and the docks were filled with crews from other ships beginning their routines. As soon as the Resolute came into view, the laughter started again. "Make room for the toy boat," someone called out. "Did they shrink it in the wash?" Another voice shouted. A few sailors on the Resolute clenched their jaws. One young recruit looked ready to shout back, but an older crewman placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't react," he whispered. "They don't know what this ship can do." The recruit took a deep breath and stayed quiet, though his face burned red. Commander Ward stepped onto the deck holding a clipboard. He heard everything, but he refused to show any reaction. Instead, he called out instructions in a clear, steady voice. "Prepare for docking. Engines to idle. Lines ready." His calmness spread through the crew. Even with laughter ringing around them, they performed their tasks professionally, not a movement out of sync. Watching them work together, Ward felt a quiet pride. The world could laugh all it wanted. The laughter wouldn't matter when the time came, and that time was coming faster than anyone expected. In the following days, intelligence reports grew more urgent. Enemy radio signals increased. Scout drones showed unusual movement patterns near the border. Analysts predicted that the assault might come at any moment. The Navy moved many ships into defensive positions, but the fleet was still spread too wide. If the enemy launched a surprise attack, several regions would be left vulnerable. One evening, just after sunset, Ward was called into an urgent briefing. The room was filled with tension. Maps displayed red markers approaching the coastline. Officers whispered rapidly, their voices filled with concern. "The enemy fleet is accelerating," a senior strategist announced. "They may strike sooner than expected." The admiral in charge leaned forward. "Which ships are closest to intercept?" One officer read from his list. "The ironclad Serpent is too far south. The Sovereign is still in repairs. Most of the Northern Division is refueling. The only ship close enough to respond within the hour is—" He hesitated. Everyone turned to look at the screen. The name flashing on the map was HMS Resolute. A silence filled the room. A few officers exchanged doubtful looks. "The Resolute," someone muttered. "They can't be serious. That ship isn't battle-ready," another said under his breath. But the admiral wasn't laughing. He stared at the glowing dot on the map, understanding the situation clearly. "It's the only ship in position," he said finally, "whether anyone likes it or not." Ward met the admiral's eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He simply nodded once, firmly. The ship that everyone mocked was now the only one standing between the nation and a sudden attack. The moment that Ward had been preparing for, the moment no one believed would ever come, was now approaching with unstoppable speed. And the crew, after months of being ridiculed, would soon learn exactly what their strange little ship was truly capable of. Night settled over the ocean like a heavy blanket, hiding the waves beneath a layer of darkness. The HMS Resolute cut through the water with quiet speed, its engines whispering instead of roaring. The crew moved quickly through the narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing softly. They all knew something serious was happening, even before the official orders were announced. They could feel it in the air. The ship felt different, charged, tense, like it was holding its breath. Commander Elias Ward stood in the central control room, staring at the glowing radar screen. Several bright red dots moved steadily across the display. The enemy fleet, bigger than expected, faster than predicted. They were heading straight for the vulnerable northern coastline. Ward closed his eyes for a moment. This was the moment he had been preparing for. This was what all the drills, all the training, all the determination had been leading toward. While other ships were too far or too slow, the Resolute was the only vessel close enough to intercept. The fleet everyone trusted wasn't here. The ship everyone mocked was outside the control room. The crew whispered among themselves. "Is it true?" a young sailor asked. "Are we really the only ones near the enemy?" "Looks like it," another answered. "We're first in line." Some of them looked nervous. Some looked excited, but none were laughing. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a simple patrol. If the Resolute failed, thousands of innocent civilians along the coast would be at risk. When Ward finally stepped out into the corridor, the crew fell silent. His calm face didn't show the weight of responsibility he carried. "All hands," Ward said, his voice steady. "Prepare for interception." A moment later, alarms sounded throughout the ship, not panicked wails, but sharp, controlled tones that awakened every member of the crew. People rushed to their stations. Engineers ran toward the engine room. Navigators strapped themselves into their seats, and gunners checked the experimental cannons that had never been used in real combat. The ship changed instantly. Fear turned into focus. Doubt turned into determination. Every sailor felt the same electrifying truth. This was their chance to prove the world wrong. In the engine room, the propulsion jets hummed as engineers adjusted pressure levels and checked gauges. The strange underwater jet system, once the target of many jokes, now roared with strength. The entire ship vibrated as power surged through its metal bones. In the navigation room, charts were quickly laid out. The helmsman wiped sweat from his palms and gripped the steering controls. He had practiced these maneuvers hundreds of times, but never with real lives at stake. On the deck, the night air was sharp and cold. The stars looked like small fires scattered through the sky. The gunners loaded ammunition into the rapid-fire cannons, their hands working faster than they ever had. "Commander on deck," someone shouted. Ward stepped onto the bridge platform, looking out at the dark sea. He knew the next hour could define the future of the Navy. But he also knew something else. His crew was ready. A voice crackled through the radio. It was the high command officer stationed on a distant ship. "Resolute, listen carefully. The enemy fleet is approaching the northern inlet. You are the only vessel able to intercept in time. Your task is to delay them until reinforcements arrive. Do not attempt full engagement. Repeat, do not attempt full engagement." Ward stared at the radio for a moment, then quietly switched it off. He didn't bother repeating the message to his crew. He knew what the others thought. The Resolute was too small, too weak, too strange to stand against a major fleet. But Ward had no intention of simply delaying the enemy. He intended to stop them. As the ship raced across the water, the first signs of the approaching fleet appeared. A faint red glow on the horizon, the distant flash of searchlights, the muffled thunder of heavy engines. The enemy ships moved in a tight formation, confident and powerful. They didn't expect resistance yet. They certainly didn't expect a small, odd-looking ship to challenge them. "Commander," the radar officer said, "we're within their detection range. They'll see us soon." Ward nodded. "Good, let them." His words sent a strange thrill through the crew. Minutes later, the Resolute's sensors detected the enemy's targeting systems activating. The incoming fleet had spotted them. The first enemy ship, a large destroyer, adjusted its path directly toward them. The helmsman turned to Ward. "Orders, sir." Ward stepped closer, his voice calm but filled with fire. "Full speed. Bring us to the left flank. We'll slip past their front line." The helmsman swallowed hard but nodded. He pushed the controls forward. The propulsion jets roared, and the Resolute surged ahead with breathtaking speed. It sliced through the water with impossible agility, leaving a streak of foam in its wake. On the enemy ships, officers must have stared in confusion. No Navy ship had ever moved like that. The first volley of enemy artillery fired bright streaks of light tearing across the sky. The shells roared down toward the Resolute. But Ward had trained his crew for this exact moment. "Hard right," he shouted. The Resolute pivoted sharply like a dancer spinning on one foot. The shells crashed into the water where the ship had been just seconds earlier. Waves exploded upward, but not one shot touched the Resolute. The crew gasped in awe. This was the maneuver they had practiced over and over, but seeing it work under real fire brought goosebumps to their skin. "We can do this," someone whispered. Ward pointed toward a gap in the enemy formation. "Take us through there. Their communication ship is in the center. If we disable it, they'll lose coordination." The helmsman didn't hesitate. The Resolute shot forward, weaving between deadly lines of fire. The enemy ships scrambled to adjust their guns, but the Resolute moved faster than they could react. It wasn't a giant fortress like the other ships. It didn't need to be. It was quick, sharp, unpredictable, everything the enemy wasn't prepared for. "Gunners, prepare to fire," Ward ordered. The gunners aimed the experimental cannons. Weapons were smaller than normal naval guns, but they fired rapidly with incredible accuracy. The crew held their breath. Fire. The cannons unleashed a storm of glowing projectiles. The shots hit the enemy communication ship exactly where Ward wanted, at the exposed antenna arrays and signal towers. Sparks burst into the air. Lights flickered on the enemy vessel. Its communication systems went dark. They're scrambling, the radar officer shouted. They've lost coordination. A cheer rose among the Resolute's crew, but it was quickly cut short. 3 enemy ships broke formation, turning toward the Resolute. Their guns lit up, preparing to unleash overwhelming firepower. Commander, an officer said anxiously. They're focusing everything on us. Ward gave a small smile. Good, let them try. The enemy ships fired a massive barrage, the sky filled with streaks of light, bright, deadly, unstoppable, evasive pattern Delta 5. Ward commanded. The helmsman's hands flew across the controls. The Resolute twisted, rolled, and surged forward. Waves crashed over the sides as the ship dodged shot after shot. Explosions illuminated the night sky, but the ship slipped through the chaos like a fish escaping nets. One enemy shell struck the water so close that the shockwave shook the deck, but the reinforced hull absorbed the force. We're still stable, an engineer shouted. Ward's voice rose. Bring us alongside their lead destroyer. The crew reacted instantly. The Resolute darted toward the massive ship, approaching it from an angle no traditional vessel could manage. The enemy destroyer tried to aim downward, but its cannons were too slow. Gunners, Ward shouted. Take out its weapon mounts. The rapid-fire cannons blazed again. The shots ripped through the destroyer's exposed mounts, disabling its guns one by one. Flames burst across the enemy ship's deck. Cheers erupted across the Resolute in the chaos. Enemy ships continued firing, but confusion was spreading. Without their communication ship, without clear formation, their attacks grew uncoordinated and sloppy. Ward looked around the control room. His crew was sweating, shaking, but their eyes burned with pride. This is our turning point, Ward said quietly. Today the world learns what this ship can do. And the crew believed him. For the first time since the Resolute was built, for the first time since the mockery began, they felt invincible. They felt united. They felt powerful. The ship everyone laughed at had just danced through the fire of a mighty fleet and struck the first real blow, and the battle had only just begun. The night sky was glowing with flashes of fire as the battle grew fiercer. The HMS Resolute moved like a streak of silver across the dark water, its wake shining under the moonlight. The enemy fleet, massive and heavily armed, was now fully aware that this small, strange-looking ship was not just a nuisance, it was a threat. Every enemy commander focused on it, determined to crush it and clear their path toward the northern coast. But the Resolute did not slow down. It did not fall back. It moved deeper into the chaos, carrying a crew whose fear had now turned into burning courage. Inside the control room, the air was filled with fast voices, urgent signals, and the rhythmic beeping of the radar. Commander Elias Ward stood at the center, his expression calm even though the world outside shook with exploding shells. He watched the radar closely, seeing enemy ships closing in from both sides. The formation they once held was completely broken, thanks to the Resolute's earlier attack on the communication ship. Now the enemy vessels were scattered, confused, and firing blindly in the dark. Commander, 2 more destroyers approaching from the west. The radar officer shouted. Another cruiser moving in from the north. The navigator added. Ward nodded. Bring us between them. If they want to hit us, make them risk hitting each other. The helmsman swallowed hard. That's a tight gap, sir. We've trained for this, Ward said softly. Trust the ship. The helmsman pushed the controls forward. The propulsion jets burst to life, sending the Resolute flying ahead. The ship shot between the 2 destroyers so quickly that their searchlights barely caught its outline. The enemy ships, startled, fired too late, and their shells crashed into the water dangerously close to each other. The commanders on those ships yelled orders, trying to regain control, but the confusion only grew. The crew of the Resolute felt a mix of fear and thrill. Every move they made felt impossible, yet they kept doing it. Every shot fired at them felt deadly, yet they kept dodging. It was as if the ship had become alive under their feet, responding to their touch like a trained animal that had been waiting for this moment all its life. In the engine room. Sweat drenched the engineers' faces as they rushed to control pressure levels and stabilize the propulsion system. The engines were being pushed far harder than any test had ever attempted. Pipes rattled, lights flickered, and alarms flashed, but the chief engineer barked commands confidently. Hold the pressure. Don't let it drop. This ship can take it. Keep those jets running. The men and women working there knew the risks. If anything went wrong, if even one valve failed, the engines could overheat or shut down completely. But none of them hesitated. They trusted Ward, they trusted the ship, and they trusted each other. Above deck. The wind roared as the Resolute raced forward. The gunners were drenched in sweat, gripping their weapons tightly. Their rapid-fire cannons glowed from constant use, smoke rising from their barrels. But the crew continued to load and fire, never letting up. A gunner shouted. The cruiser's exposing its side. Ward reacted instantly. Target its engine vents. Fire now. The cannons unleashed a storm of shots. The projectiles struck the cruiser's side with perfect accuracy. hitting the vents where the enemy ship's heat systems were located. Moments later, a huge burst of fire exploded from the cruiser's rear. Flames shot into the sky as the massive vessel slowed, its engines failing. A cheer erupted throughout the Resolute, filling the ship like a wave of electricity. But Ward knew the battle wasn't over. "Don't celebrate yet," he said firmly. "More ships are moving in." And he was right. The largest ship in the enemy fleet, a heavy battleship with thick armor and broad cannons, was turning directly toward the Resolute. Its lights locked onto them, and its massive guns began to rotate. "That battleship could destroy us with just a few shots," the first officer warned. Ward's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll make sure it can't aim." He pointed ahead. "Helmsman, bring us in close." The helmsman stared wide. "Closer. Their forward cannons are too slow to track us at that range," Ward finished. "Trust me." The crew exchanged nervous glances. Getting close to a battleship was like standing beneath a falling boulder. One mistake, and everything would end. But no one questioned Ward. The Resolute surged forward again, cutting across the waves like a knife. The battleship opened fire. Huge shells tore through the sky, shaking the air with their power. The explosions thundered so loudly that even the metal under the crew's feet vibrated. A single hit would have destroyed the Resolute completely. "Hard left," Ward ordered. The ship spun sharply, and the first volley crashed into the water behind them. Spray rose like a wall of white. The crew held on tightly, their hearts pounding. The battleship fired again, hard right. The Resolute dodged once more, barely slipping past the deadly blast. Now it was close, far too close for the battleship's big guns to aim downward in time. "Gunners," Ward shouted. "Target the weapon turrets. Disable them." The gunners aimed and fired. The rapid-fire cannons rattled loudly as they unleashed a torrent of glowing rounds. The shots hit the battleship's exposed weapons, one turret, then another, then the third. Sparks flew like fireworks. Smoke billowed. The battleship's guns froze, jammed and useless. "She's defenseless," a gunner yelled. Ward raised his hand. "Not yet. Their engine systems are still active." He turned to the helmsman. "Take us under their blind spot. Circle behind them." The Resolute dove into the darkness again, slipping behind the massive vessel. The enemy crew scrambled to adjust. Officers shouted. Lights flickered. But the Resolute was too fast on when they reached the battleship's rear. Ward gave the final order. "Fire everything at their engines." The gunners pressed the triggers. The cannons unleashed a storm of firepower, striking the battleship's engines with precise, devastating accuracy. Within seconds, a huge explosion swallowed the rear of the ship. The battleship shuddered violently, smoke pouring out of its sides. It began to slow, losing power, drifting helplessly in the water. The crew of the Resolute stared at the sight in disbelief. They had done the unthinkable. They had crippled the largest ship in the enemy fleet. "Commander," the radar officer said, voice shaking, "the remaining enemy ships are turning back. They're retreating." For a moment, the entire ship fell silent. No sound but the wind and the distant thunder of dying fires filled the air. Then the crew erupted in chirps, loud, joyful, unstoppable. Some laughed, some cried, some hugged each other tightly. After months of being mocked, doubted, and ignored, they had done what no one believed they could do. Commander Ward finally allowed himself a small smile. He looked at his crew, tired, sweaty, bruised, but victorious. They had faced a fleet much stronger than themselves. They had fought against ships that dwarfed them in size and firepower. And yet, they had stood their ground. They had won through courage, skill, and teamwork. But Ward knew the truth. The battle wasn't just about defeating the enemy fleet. It was about proving their worth to the world, to the Navy, to the commanders who doubted them, to the sailors who laughed, and even to themselves as the Resolute sailed slowly through the fading smoke. With the enemy fleet scattered and broken behind them, every crew member understood something powerful. This ship was no joke. It was a legend in the making, and tonight, under the moonlit sky, the ship everyone mocked had just annihilated a fleet. Commander Elias Ward stood on the deck of the HMS Resolute the morning after the great battle, staring at the calm sea that only hours ago had been filled with fire, smoke, and chaos. The ship moved gently with the waves, almost as if it, too, was tired from everything it had done. The crew walked around slowly, checking equipment and repairing small damages, but their faces were different now. They no longer looked embarrassed to serve on this ship. They no longer kept their heads down when others looked at them. Instead, they carried a quiet pride, like they finally knew their true worth. News of the battle had already begun, spreading across the entire Navy. Signals from other warships came in non-stop, asking if the reports were true. Did the small, mocked ship really stop an entire enemy fleet almost by itself? Did the little vessel that everyone had laughed at truly save countless lives? Officers from nearby ships kept requesting details, unable to believe what they were hearing. For years, the Resolute had been called useless, strange, even pathetic. But now, every whisper carried respect. Back on shore, High Command was in shock. No one had expected the Resolute to do anything more than delay the enemy for a few minutes. They had assumed it would retreat or fall apart under heavy fire. Instead, it had held its ground, fought with unmatched skill, and used its special design exactly how its builders had once hoped but had never been brave enough to test. When the full report came in, the Naval Council read each line with disbelief. They checked it 3 times, asking again and again if there had been some mistake. But the message stayed the same. The Resolute had changed the outcome of the entire conflict. Commander Ward and his officers were immediately ordered back to the capital city. A special escort ship arrived to bring them home. When the crew stepped onto the pier, they expected a quiet arrival, maybe some curious looks, but instead, thousands of people were waiting. They cheered, waved flags, and called out the ship's name again and again. The crowd's voices echoed through the harbor like thunder. Some people pushed forward to shake the crew's hands. Families cried with relief, knowing that the Resolute had prevented a disaster that could have cost many lives. Ward felt overwhelmed. He had spent years defending a ship that no one else believed in. He had argued with officers who laughed at him, stood firm during meetings where he was treated like a fool, and spent endless nights training his crew in secret. Now, those same officers stepped forward with admiration. They shook his hand with respect instead of pity. Some even apologized, their voices sincere. Ward accepted their words politely, but deep inside, he knew something important. The Resolute had not become great by accident. It had become great because its crew never gave up, even when everyone else did. A grand ceremony was organized to honor the ship and its people. The event took place in a massive hall decorated with banners, medals, and symbols of the nation's strength. Every important leader attended, including the highest-ranking admiral. When Commander Ward walked onto the stage, the entire room stood up in applause. He felt a strange mix of happiness and humility, because he knew he had not done this alone. The crew had fought beside him with courage that no medal could truly capture. One by one, members of the crew received awards for bravery. Some tried to hide their smiles, still not used to so much attention. Others held back tears as they remembered how everyone had mocked them before the battle. The youngest crew member, barely 20 years old, stood trembling as the medal was placed around his neck. He whispered to Ward afterward that he had never felt proud of anything in his life until now. Ward simply placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he had earned it. After the ceremony, the Navy announced a major change. New ships would be designed using the same principles as the Resolute. Engineers studied every part of the vessel, trying to understand how something so underestimated had become so powerful. Suddenly, the design that had once been mocked became the foundation for the future. Naval academies added special lessons about the Resolute's battle, teaching new officers how innovation, courage, and adaptability could change everything. The Resolute itself became a legend. Tourists visited the harbor where it was stationed just to walk near it. Children pointed at it with excitement, imagining themselves fighting heroic battles one day. Painters created artwork showing the ship cutting through enemy lines. Writers published stories celebrating its victory. The ship that everyone had once laughed at was now admired by an entire nation. But for Ward, the most important moments were the quiet ones. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand alone on the deck and think about everything that had happened. He remembered the insults, the doubts, and the jokes whispered behind his back. He remembered how his crew had trained in the dark when no one was watching. And he remembered the battle, the fear, the fire, the storm of enemy shells, and the courage that had risen from his people. What made the Resolute special was not just its unusual design. It was the belief that something different, something new, could still be valuable. It was the idea that true strength does not always come from size or appearance. Sometimes it comes from the heart of those who refuse to give up. As months passed, the ship continued to serve, but now with honor. When it sailed into foreign ports, other navies saluted it. Commanders came aboard to study its design and speak with Ward. They asked how he had known the ship could do what it did. Ward always answered the same way. I trusted what others were too afraid to trust. And each time he said those words, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The enemy nation, after suffering the defeat, eventually sent messages seeking peace. Even they could not deny the bravery with which the Resolute fought. Their own newspapers wrote about the small ship that had outmaneuvered their strongest fleet. Some enemy officers even admitted that they had underestimated it because it looked weak. In the years that followed, the Resolute remained a symbol of hope. Schools taught children about how one underestimated ship had changed the course of history. Songs were written about it. Veterans spoke with pride about the day they served on board. When the ship was finally retired after years of loyal service, the government preserved it as a national monument. People continued to visit it for decades, touching its metal frame as if it carried some magic. And long after the last crew member had moved on to new roles, the legend lived on. Parents told their children the story of a ship that everyone mocked until the day it annihilated a fleet. The message of the story was simple but powerful. Greatness does not always come from what others see. Sometimes it comes from what others fail to see. Commander Ward's name was recorded in history books, but he never let the fame change him. He often visited the old ship, walking its silent deck with the same gentle respect he had shown when no one believed in it. To him, the Resolute was more than a warship. It was a reminder that courage grows strongest in the shadows of doubt. It was proof that even when the world laughs, determination can turn mockery into victory. And so, the story of the HMS Resolute became a timeless lesson for generations. It taught people to trust in their abilities to stand strong against ridicule, and to keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible, because sometimes, the world needs to be shaken before it understands the worth of what it once ignored.